My aunt moved me across the country, while my mom was in a coma and told me, "You'll have a life she never could have given you." When I tried to talk about missing my mother, she said, "You're being dramatic." I just stared at her. That was 2 years ago. Last month, she started screaming. She was being framed as police took her away in handcuffs. When I was 16, I was kidnapped by my aunt. My mom was in a coma after getting into a near-fatal car accident. She picked up a cake at the store when I told her I got straight A's, and she wanted to come home and celebrate it with me, when someone was drinking and swerved into her lane, which made my mom lose control and drive into a ditch. My aunt got emergency guardianship of me immediately. The weirder part was my Aunt Gertrude and my mom weren't on speaking terms. They hadn't been for years. She would look at me and say, "Don't worry, in time you'll see it's better this way," or "You'll have a life that Sarah never could have given you." Within a week, she moved me 800 miles away to their mansion and enrolled me at some elite prep school. She bought me a whole new wardrobe and kept telling everyone how she rescued her poor niece from poverty. I went along with it at first because I was 16 and terrified. I let her brag to her friends about how she saved me, about how without her I'd be homeless. I even let her drag my mother's name through the dirt in front of others because I was too exhausted to fight. But then she started to treat my grief like it was some kind of character flaw. Whenever I tried to talk about missing my mom, she would say, "You're being dramatic," or "Dwelling on the past won't help anyone." That was when I knew something had to change. So I did something for myself and started volunteering at the children's hospital through school. Working with kids whose parents were sick reminded me of who I actually was and helped me bond. These kids needed someone, and I finally felt useful instead of like some trophy Gertrude showed off. That's when everything exploded. Gertrude found out about my volunteering and went absolutely insane. She screamed at me about how it was morbid and unhealthy and how I needed to let go of my stupid clinging to my mom, but I refused to quit, so she threatened to pull me out of school entirely just so I couldn't volunteer. She kept yelling about everything I owed them for their generosity and how everything I have is because of them. I realized she didn't see me as a person. I was a possession she could control and make her own. That's when I started digging through their house. I found a folder hidden in my uncle's office with legal documents that made me sick. My mom had a substantial life insurance policy that Gertrude was controlling as my guardian, but worse than that were the hospital bills. Gertrude had been refusing expensive treatments for my mom's recovery, claiming they were unnecessary expenses, treatments that could have helped her wake up. She was literally letting my mother suffer in a coma to save money while buying me designer clothes and bragging about what a hero she was. I used money I'd saved from volunteering to secretly contact a lawyer. I learned I could petition for emancipation and that Gertrude was legally required to continue my mom's treatment. I started documenting everything. Then came Gertrude's big charity gala. The local women's club was honoring her for taking in her orphaned niece, and she was practically glowing with pride. 100 were there celebrating what an amazing person she was. During the speech portion, I walked up to the microphone. Gertrude looked confused but proud, probably thinking I was going to give some touching testimonial about her kindness, and I was. "I'd like to thank my Aunt Gertrude for everything she's done for me," I started. "Thank you for moving me 800 miles away from my mother who's still fighting for her life in a coma. Thank you for refusing the medical treatments that could help her recover. Thank you for stealing my inheritance while telling everyone how generous you are." Gertrude's smile started faltering. "Thank you for forbidding me from calling the hospital because my grief over my dying mother was too dramatic for you," I continued, my voice getting stronger. "Thank you for treating me like a trophy. Thank you for calling my mother irresponsible while she worked 2 jobs to support us." I pulled out the legal documents and held them up. "These hospital bills show exactly which treatments you refused and how much money you've stolen from my mother's insurance policy while she fights for her life." The silence in that room was deafening. Gertrude's face went from horror to panic to devastation to rage and everything else. 100 of her biggest social connections were staring at her in complete disgust. Some people had their hands over their mouths in shock. Gertrude tried to stammer out some explanation, but people were already walking out. The best part was watching her try to explain herself as criminal investigators started looking into fraud charges. Her perfect reputation was destroyed in a single night. But the story doesn't end here, because last week I was visiting my mom when a nurse mentioned something that made my blood run cold. She said, "It's so weird that your aunt was here the night of the accident. She arrived about 20 minutes before the ambulance even got the call." I stared at the nurse, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst through my chest. Gertrude had been at the hospital before anyone even called 911. The implications crashed over me like a tidal wave. The nurse must have seen something in my expression because she quickly backtracked. She explained that Gertrude had told the staff she was driving by coincidentally when she saw the accident happen, but something in her tone suggested she didn't quite believe it either. I thanked the nurse and stumbled out of the hospital, my mind racing. The drive back to Gertrude's mansion felt like it took hours. Every red light gave me more time to think, to piece together what this meant. If Gertrude was there before the accident was even reported, then maybe the hammered driver story wasn't the whole truth. Maybe it wasn't the truth at all. When I got back, the house was empty. Gertrude was still dealing with the fallout from the gala disaster, meeting with lawyers and trying to salvage what was left of her reputation. Uncle was nowhere to be found, which had become normal lately. He'd been avoiding me since the gala, barely making eye contact when we passed in the halls. I went straight to Uncle's office. If Gertrude had been hiding documents about my mother's insurance and medical care, what else might be hidden in this house? I started pulling open drawers, rifling through filing cabinets, looking for anything that might explain how Gertrude knew about the accident before it was reported. That's when I found it. Tucked behind a stack of tax returns was a receipt from an auto body shop dated 3 days after my mother's accident. The work order was for front-end damage repair on Gertrude's Mercedes. My hands shook as I read the details. The timestamp on the receipt showed it was scheduled the morning after the accident, before Gertrude could have known about any damage to her car, unless she already knew because she'd been driving it when it happened. I heard the front door slam and quickly shoved the receipt into my pocket. Gertrude's heels clicked on the marble floor, getting closer. I grabbed a random folder from the desk and pretended to be reading it when she appeared in the doorway. Her face was drawn and pale, her usually perfect makeup smudged. She looked at me with an expression I'd never seen before. Not anger exactly, but something colder, calculating. She asked what I was doing in Uncle's office. office. I told her I was looking for my birth certificate for the emancipation paperwork. Her eyes narrowed, and for a moment I thought she might grab the folder from my hands. Instead, she told me that after my performance at the gala, she'd decided to reconsider our arrangement. She suggested I might be happier in a boarding school, far away, maybe even overseas. I nodded and mumbled something about thinking it over, then escaped to my room. My hands were still shaking as I pulled out the receipt and really studied it. The damage description mentioned paint transfer, red paint. My mother's car was red. Over the next few days, I became obsessed with that receipt. I called the auto body shop pretending to be Gertrude's assistant, following up on warranty work. The mechanic remembered the job clearly because Gertrude had paid cash and insisted all damaged parts be disposed of immediately. He thought it was strange, but figured rich people had their quirks. I started mapping out the timeline of that night. My mother had left the house at 7:30 p.m. to pick up the cake. The accident was reported at 8:15 p.m., but according to the nurse, Gertrude arrived at the hospital at 7:55 p.m., 20 minutes before the 911 call. The cake shop was only 10 minutes from our house. The accident site was another 15 minutes away. The math didn't add up unless Gertrude knew exactly where my mother would be. I needed more information, but I couldn't investigate openly. Gertrude was watching me constantly now, and Uncle seemed to disappear whenever I entered a room. So I started volunteering extra shifts at the hospital, using the computer access to pull up records from that night. The police report was frustratingly vague. A witness had called in about a red sedan in a ditch, the driver unconscious. The witness, who didn't leave their name, described seeing another car speeding away from the scene, a dark luxury car, like a Mercedes. I printed everything I could find and hid the papers in my school locker. Each piece of evidence felt like another weight on my chest. The woman who had taken me in, who controlled my mother's medical care, who held my entire future in her hands, might have been the one who put my mother in that hospital bed. One evening, Uncle was in his office when Gertrude went to her book club. I'd been waiting for this chance. I knocked on his door and entered before he could tell me to go away. He looked up from his computer, and I saw fear flash across his face. I closed the door behind me and pulled out the auto body receipt. His face went white. He started to speak, but I cut him off. I told him I knew Gertrude was at the hospital before the accident was called in. I told him about the paint transfer, the timeline that didn't make sense, the witness report of a dark luxury car fleeing the scene. Uncle's hands trembled as he poured himself a drink from the bottle he kept in his desk drawer. He downed it in one gulp, then poured another. Finally, he looked at me with haunted eyes and told me to leave it alone. He said I didn't understand what Gertrude was capable of, that pushing this would only make things worse for everyone. But his reaction told me everything I needed to know. He knew something. Maybe he knew everything. I spent the next week watching Uncle, noting his patterns. He left the house every Tuesday and Thursday evening, always returning looking more miserable than before. I decided to follow him. He drove to a bar on the other side of town, the kind of place where Gertrude's society friends would never go. I waited in my car for an hour before going in. I found him in a back booth, well into his fourth whiskey. I slid into the seat across from him. He looked at me with bloodshot eyes and laughed bitterly. He asked if I really wanted to know the truth. I told him I already knew most of it. I just needed him to fill in the blanks. That's when he broke. He told me Gertrude had been planning something for weeks before the accident. She'd been tracking my mother's routines, her routes, her schedule. She knew about the cake tradition, knew my mother would go to that specific store when I got good grades. Gertrude had even called him that night, telling him to be ready with alibis. But he swore he didn't know she was actually going to do it. He thought she was just angry, just venting about my mother. He never imagined she would try to cull her own sister. I asked about the hammered driver story. Uncle laughed again, a sound like breaking glass. There was no hammered driver. Gertrude had called him from the scene, hysterical, saying there had been an accident. She made him call the police with an anonymous tip about seeing a hammered driver swerve into my mother's lane. He'd been too shocked, too scared to refuse. The weight of his confession hung between us. I asked why he hadn't said anything, why he'd let Gertrude get away with it. He looked at me with those broken eyes and said Gertrude had made it clear that if he ever talked, he'd be implicated too. After all, he'd made the false witness call. He'd helped her establish an alibi. In the eyes of the law, he was an accomplice. I left him there in that booth, drowning in whiskey and guilt. My mind was reeling, but I knew I had to be careful. Gertrude had already proven she was willing to cull to get what she wanted. If she realized I knew the truth, I could be next. I started building my case methodically. I recorded my conversation with Uncle on my phone, though the audio was muffled by bar noise. I gathered every piece of evidence I could find. The receipt, the timeline, the hospital records. I even went back to the accident site and took photos, looking for any evidence the police might have missed. That's when I found it. Caught in a bush about 20 feet from where my mother's car had gone off the road was a piece of black plastic. It looked like part of a headlight cover. Mercedes headlight covers were made of exactly that kind of plastic. Gertrude must have sensed something was changing because she started tightening her control. She had the school counselor call me in for wellness checks. She hired a driver to take me to and from school, claiming it was for my safety after my breakdown at the gala. She even started sitting in on my calls with a lawyer, making it clear that any legal action I took would have to go through her. But she'd made one mistake. In her rush to discredit me after the gala, she'd told everyone I was having a mental breakdown, that I was making wild accusations because of grief, which meant when I finally went to the police with my evidence, I could point to her pattern of trying to silence me. I knew I had one shot at this. If I went to the police and they didn't believe me, Gertrude would know I was onto her. So I waited, gathering more evidence, building an airtight case. I learned that Gertrude had increased my mother's life insurance policy just 2 months before the accident, forging my mother's signature. I found emails between Gertrude and Uncle discussing my mother's problem and how it needed to be handled. The final piece fell into place when I went back to the hospital. The same nurse who'd mentioned Gertrude's early arrival pulled me aside. She said she'd been thinking about that night, and something else had bothered her. Gertrude's clothes. When she'd arrived, claiming to have seen the accident while driving by, she was wearing different clothes than she'd worn to dinner with friends earlier that evening. The nurse remembered because Gertrude's dinner companions had called the hospital worried when Gertrude left suddenly, and they'd described what she was wearing. Why would Gertrude have changed clothes between dinner and accidentally discovering my mother's accident, unless she knew she was going to do something that might get her clothes dirty or bloody? I thanked the nurse and asked if she'd be willing to make a statement. She hesitated, then nodded. She said she'd always felt something was off about that night. night, and if it could help my mother get justice, she'd do it. That night, I lay in bed planning my next move. I had evidence, I had witnesses, I had motive, but Gertrude was smart, connected, and ruthless. She'd already tried to call once. I had to be smarter. I thought about my mother, lying in that hospital bed, fighting for her life while the woman who put her there controlled her care. I thought about all the treatments Gertrude had refused, all the chances for recovery she'd denied. I thought about how Gertrude had stolen not just money, but time. Time my mother and I should have had together. Tomorrow, I would take everything to the police. But tonight, I had one more thing to do. I crept back to Uncle's office and found what I was looking for. Gertrude's day planner from the week of the accident. There, in her own handwriting, was the final piece of proof I needed. Written on the day of the accident, hours before it happened, was a note. S. Cake run tonight. Route 47, 8 p.m. My mother's initial. The cake run she always did when I got good grades. The exact route she would take. The precise time she would be there. Gertrude hadn't just caused the accident. She'd hunted my mother down. I took a photo of the planner page, my hands steady now despite everything. Tomorrow would change everything. Tomorrow, Gertrude would learn that she'd underestimated me. She thought I was just a grieving teenager she could control. She was wrong. As I walked back to my room, I passed Gertrude's door. I could hear her inside, on the phone with someone, laughing about something. She had no idea that her perfect crime was about to unravel. No idea that the niece she'd tried to turn into a puppet had been gathering the strings to bring her down. I thought about the nurse's revelation that started all this. Such a small detail, Gertrude arriving too early. But that one thread, when pulled, had revealed the whole ugly truth. Tomorrow, I would hand that truth over to people who could do something about it. Gertrude had taken my mother from me, had tried to steal my inheritance, had attempted to control my entire life, but she'd failed to take the one thing that mattered most, my determination to get justice. The next morning would begin the fight of my life. Gertrude had money, connections, and a carefully crafted reputation, but I had something more powerful. I had the truth, and I had nothing left to lose. The morning arrived faster than I expected. Gertrude was already in the kitchen when I came downstairs, her perfectly manicured hands wrapped around a coffee mug. She studied me over the rim, and I forced myself to act normal, grabbing cereal and sitting at the breakfast bar. The driver she'd hired was already waiting outside, ready to take me to school and ensure I didn't deviate from her approved schedule. At school, I slipped away during lunch and used the payphone to call the police station. The detective who answered listened patiently as I explained I had evidence about my mother's accident. He agreed to meet me after school, giving me the address of a coffee shop near the precinct. I hung up, my heart racing. This was really happening. The rest of the school day crawled by. Gertrude's driver was waiting exactly where he always was, and I climbed into the back seat without protest. But when we reached the first red light, I opened the door and ran. I heard him shouting behind me, but I didn't look back. I ducked into a crowded shopping center, weaving through stores until I was sure I'd lost him. The coffee shop was nearly empty when I arrived. Detective Rodriguez was already there, a tired-looking man in his 50s who introduced himself with a firm handshake. I spread my evidence across the table, explaining each piece, the receipt, the timeline, the photos from the accident scene. He examined everything carefully, taking notes. When I played the recording of Uncle's confession, his expression changed. He asked me to play it again, leaning forward to catch every word through the bar noise. After it ended, he gathered up all my evidence and told me he'd need to bring me to the station for a formal statement. He also said they'd need to re-examine the accident scene and my mother's car. My phone buzzed constantly as we drove to the station. Gertrude calling, texting, demanding to know where I was. I turned it off. At the station, I spent hours going through everything again, this time with a recorder running. Other detectives joined us, asking questions, clarifying details. They seemed especially interested in the insurance policy changes and Gertrude's presence at the hospital before the 911 call. It was dark when they finally drove me back to Gertrude's house. Detective Rodriguez walked me to the door, handing me his card. He told me not to discuss the investigation with anyone, especially Gertrude. He said they'd be in touch soon. Gertrude was waiting in the foyer, her face a mask of controlled fury. She demanded to know where I'd been, why I'd run from the driver, why the police had brought me home. I told her I'd gotten scared and gone to the police about a boy who'd been bothering me at school. She didn't believe me. I could see it in her eyes, but she couldn't prove I was lying. The next few days were tense. Gertrude watched me constantly, even having the housekeeper sit outside my room at night. She went through my things while I was at school, though she didn't find anything since I'd given all my evidence to the police. Uncle avoided both of us, spending more time than ever at his office or the bar. Then Gertrude made her move. She announced she'd enrolled me in a boarding school in Switzerland, starting immediately. She'd already packed my things. The car would take me to the airport in an hour. I protested, but she cut me off, saying it was for my own good, that I clearly needed more structure and distance from my mother's situation. I locked myself in the bathroom and called Detective Rodriguez from the phone I'd hidden in the toilet tank. He told me to stall, that they were close to making an arrest but needed more time. He said under no circumstances should I get on that plane. When I came out, I told Gertrude I felt sick. She didn't care. She supervised as the housekeeper loaded my suitcases into the car, then guided me firmly to the back seat. The driver started the engine, and I knew I had to do something drastic. As we pulled out of the driveway, I grabbed the door handle and threw myself out of the moving car. I hit the pavement hard, rolling to absorb the impact like I'd learned in gym class. Gertrude screamed at the driver to stop, but I was already running, ignoring the pain in my scraped knees and palms. I ran to the neighbor's house and pounded on their door. Mrs. Chen answered, and I begged her to call the police, saying Gertrude was trying to kidnap me. She let me in, locking the door behind us. Through the window, I could see Gertrude arguing with the driver, gesturing wildly at Mrs. Chen's house. The police arrived within minutes, not just a patrol car, but several vehicles, including Detective Rodriguez. They went straight to Gertrude, who tried to explain that she was my legal guardian and was simply taking me to school. But the detective had a warrant. They were arresting her for attempted murder, fraud, and falsifying evidence. Gertrude's composure finally cracked. She screamed that I was lying, that I was a disturbed child who'd made everything up, but the handcuffs went on anyway. As they led her to the police car, she turned to look at me, and the hatred in her eyes made my blood run cold. Uncle came home to find police searching the house. When they told him Gertrude had been arrested, he collapsed into a chair. They questioned him for hours, and eventually, he broke down completely, confirming everything he'd told me at the bar and more. He admitted to helping helping stage the accident scene, to making the false witness report, to helping Gertrude forge documents. The investigation moved quickly after that. They found Gertrude's car in a storage unit she'd rented under a fake name. Despite the repairs, forensic experts found evidence of the collision with my mother's car. They found my mother's blood on the undercarriage. They found Gertrude's hair caught in the damaged headlight assembly. More evidence emerged from Gertrude's computer. She'd researched car accident injuries, how to stage accident scenes, how long people could survive in comas. She'd looked up my mother's routes to work, to the grocery store, to everywhere she went regularly. The planning had been meticulous and cold. The medical examiner reviewed my mother's injuries with new information. The pattern of trauma was consistent with being struck by another vehicle first, then crashing into the ditch. What had been attributed to the accident could now be seen as evidence of assault. I moved in with Mrs. Chen temporarily, while the legal system sorted everything out. She was kind, making me tea and letting me cry on her couch. I visited my mother every day, now that Gertrude couldn't stop me. The doctor started the treatments Gertrude had refused, and within a week there were signs of improvement. My mother's brain activity increased. She started responding to stimuli. Gertrude's lawyer tried to arrange a plea deal, but the prosecutor refused. The evidence was too overwhelming, the crime too heinous. Gertrude tried to claim mental illness, but psychological evaluations found her competent to stand trial. She'd known exactly what she was doing. Uncle was arrested too, charged as an accomplice. He cooperated fully, providing more details about Gertrude's planning. He revealed that Gertrude had been embezzling from my mother for years before the accident, using her position at the family business to hide the theft. When my mother discovered it and threatened to go to the police, Gertrude decided she had to be eliminated. The news of Gertrude's arrest spread through her social circle like wildfire. The same women who'd honored her at the charity gala now shared stories of things that had seemed odd in retrospect. Her obsession with money and status, her cruel comments about family members, the way she'd always needed to control everything and everyone around her. I found out Gertrude had done this before. An elderly aunt had died in a fall down the stairs 5 years earlier, leaving Gertrude a substantial inheritance. The death had been ruled accidental, but now police were reopening the case. They found inconsistencies in Gertrude's alibi, suspicious financial transactions before the death. My mother's condition continued to improve with proper treatment. The doctors were cautiously optimistic about her chances of waking up. I spent hours by her bedside, holding her hand, telling her everything that had happened. Sometimes I swore I felt her squeeze back. Gertrude's assets were frozen during the investigation. The mansion, the cars, the jewelry, all of it was tied up in legal proceedings. But I didn't care about any of that. I just wanted my mother back. I wanted Gertrude to pay for what she'd done. The investigation revealed more victims. Gertrude had been systematically stealing from elderly relatives for over a decade, using her charm and family connections to gain access to their finances. Some had died under suspicious circumstances. Others had been left destitute, too ashamed to admit they'd been robbed by family. I testified before a grand jury, telling them everything I knew. It was terrifying, but I thought of my mother lying in that hospital bed and found my courage. The grand jury indicted Gertrude on multiple counts of attempted murder, fraud, and conspiracy. Gertrude tried one last manipulation. She had another inmate pass me a message, offering to reveal where she'd hidden more of my mother's money if I would testify that she'd been a good guardian. I gave the note straight to Detective Rodriguez. They added witness tampering to her charges. 3 months after Gertrude's arrest, I was sitting by my mother's bed when her eyes fluttered open. She looked at me, confused at first, then recognition dawned. She tried to speak, but her voice was just a whisper. I leaned close, and she managed one word that made me sob with relief and joy. She said my name. The recovery was slow. My mother had to relearn many basic functions, but she was alive, she was awake, and she remembered. She remembered the night of the accident, too. She told the police how Gertrude had run her off the road, how she'd seen her sister's face through the windshield just before impact. Gertrude's trial date was set. The prosecutor told me it would be difficult, that Gertrude's lawyer would try to discredit me, paint me as a vengeful teenager. But they had physical evidence, multiple witnesses, and a clear pattern of criminal behavior spanning years. I was placed with a foster family while my mother recovered. They were nice people who gave me space to process everything that had happened. I continued volunteering at the Children's Hospital, finding comfort in helping others through their own family medical crises. The other families Gertrude had victimized began coming forward. A cousin whose mother had died mysteriously after Gertrude became her caretaker. An uncle who'd lost his life savings to Gertrude's investment schemes. The prosecutor built a case that showed Gertrude as a serial predator who'd used family trust as a weapon. My mother grew stronger every day. She began physical therapy, speech therapy, occupational therapy. The doctor said her recovery was remarkable, that the treatments Gertrude had denied her could have prevented months of suffering. We talked about everything that had happened, and she held me while I cried about the months I'd spent under Gertrude's control. Gertrude's defense team tried every trick. They claimed the evidence was circumstantial, that Uncle was lying to save himself, that I'd manipulated the whole situation for attention. But the forensic evidence was undeniable. Gertrude's car had struck my mother's. Gertrude's own handwriting showed she'd known exactly where my mother would be that night. As the trial approached, Gertrude grew desperate. She tried to hire someone to intimidate witnesses, but the person she approached was an undercover cop. More charges were added. Her lawyer quit, and she had to get a public defender. I spent time preparing for my testimony, working with the prosecutor to understand what would happen in court. They warned me it would be brutal, that Gertrude's new lawyer would attack my character, my motives, everything about me. But I was ready. Gertrude had already done her worst to me. My mother was released from the hospital just in time to attend the trial. She was in a wheelchair still, but her mind was sharp. She would testify too, telling the jury how her own sister had tried to murder her for money. The betrayal cut deep, but she was determined to see justice done. The night before the trial began, I couldn't sleep. I thought about everything that had led to this moment. My straight A's that had triggered a celebration that never happened. The months of manipulation and control. The investigation that had revealed Gertrude's true nature. Tomorrow, it would all come to a head in court. I looked at the photo of my mother and me that I'd managed to save from Gertrude's house. We were smiling, happy, before any of this had happened. Tomorrow, I would fight to get justice for that woman in the photo, for the months of suffering Gertrude had caused, for all the families she'd destroyed in her greed. The truth was about to be told in court, and Gertrude would finally finally face the consequences of her actions. I was ready to tell my story, to show the world who Gertrude really was beneath her perfect facade. The woman who'd kidnapped me, who'd tried to kill my mother, who'd stolen from our family for years, was about to learn that her crimes had finally caught up with her. The morning of the trial arrived with an unseasonable chill. My foster parents drove me to the courthouse early, and I watched the building grow larger through the windshield. Gertrude's defense team was already there, huddled on the steps. They scattered when they saw me approach. Inside, the prosecutor walked me through the courtroom layout one more time. I memorized where I would sit, where Gertrude would be, where the jury would watch from. The bailiff tested the microphone at the witness stand. Everything felt surreal, like preparing for a play where the stakes were my mother's life. Gertrude entered wearing a conservative suit, her hair pulled back severely. She'd lost weight since her arrest, and her designer clothes hung loose on her frame. When our eyes met, she mouthed something at me. The bailiff stepped between us immediately. The prosecutor's opening statement laid out the evidence methodically. The timeline of that night, the auto body receipt, Uncle's testimony about the staged accident scene, Gertrude's own handwriting proving she knew exactly when and where my mother would be. The jury listened intently, some taking notes. Gertrude's public defender tried to paint a different picture. A grieving sister who'd taken in her orphaned niece. A misunderstanding blown out of proportion by a traumatized teenager. Financial decisions made in good faith, but even as he spoke, I could see doubt in the jurors' faces. The first witness was the mechanic from the auto body shop. He described the damage to Gertrude's Mercedes, the red paint transfer, her insistence on paying cash and disposing of all damaged parts. He'd kept photos of the repairs on his phone, which the prosecutor displayed on a screen. The front-end damage was extensive. Next came the nurse who'd first mentioned Gertrude's early arrival at the hospital. She testified about the timeline, about Gertrude arriving in different clothes than she'd worn to dinner. She described Gertrude's demeanor that night as oddly calm for someone who'd just discovered her sister in a terrible accident. The forensic expert took the stand to explain the evidence found on Gertrude's car. Despite the repairs, microscopic paint chips matched my mother's vehicle. Blood evidence on the undercarriage matched my mother's DNA. The pattern of damage was consistent with a high-speed collision. Uncle's testimony was the hardest to watch. He entered the courtroom in shackles, already serving time for his role in the cover-up. He detailed Gertrude's planning in the weeks before the accident, the surveillance of my mother's routines, the phone call that night telling him to be ready with alibis. His voice broke when he described helping Gertrude stage the accident scene, moving my mother's unconscious body. Gertrude watched it all with an expression of cold fury. Sometimes she would shake her head or whisper urgently to her lawyer, but the evidence kept mounting. Financial records showing the forged insurance documents, Gertrude's computer search history, the pattern of elderly relatives who died or been financially ruined after Gertrude gained access to their assets. When it was my turn to testify, my legs felt weak walking to the witness stand. The prosecutor started with easy questions about my life before the accident, my relationship with my mother, the night she went to buy the cake. Then we moved into the months with Gertrude, her treatment of me, the discovery of the refused medical treatments, the charity gala where I'd exposed her publicly. Gertrude's lawyer cross-examined me aggressively. He questioned my memory, my motives, my mental state. He suggested I'd fabricated evidence out of grief and anger, but I stayed calm, answering each question truthfully. When he implied I'd manipulated Uncle into lying, I simply described finding the auto body receipt myself. My mother testified from her wheelchair. Her voice was still weak, but her words were clear. She described seeing Gertrude's car coming at her, the moment of recognition before impact, waking up months later to learn her sister had tried to cull her for money. Several jurors wiped their eyes. The prosecutor presented evidence of Gertrude's other crimes, the elderly aunt who died in a suspicious fall, the relatives who'd lost their life savings, a clear pattern of escalating violence and greed spanning years. Gertrude had started with simple theft and graduated to murder. Gertrude took the stand in her own defense, against her lawyer's advice. She maintained her innocence, claiming everything was a misunderstanding. She said Uncle was lying to reduce his own sentence, that I was a troubled teenager who'd turned against her after she'd saved me from poverty. But under cross-examination, her story fell apart. She couldn't explain the auto body receipt. She couldn't explain her presence at the hospital before the 911 call. She couldn't explain the evidence on her car. The jury deliberated for less than 3 hours. When they filed back in, I held my breath. Guilty on all counts. Attempted murder, fraud, conspiracy. The list went on. Gertrude's face went white as each verdict was read. For the first time since this all began, she looked genuinely afraid. At sentencing 2 weeks later, victim impact statements were read. Families Gertrude had destroyed spoke about their losses. My mother, stronger now but still in her wheelchair, spoke about the sister she'd once loved and the monster Gertrude had become. I spoke about the months of manipulation and control, about nearly losing my mother forever. The judge sentenced Gertrude to life in prison without the possibility of parole. As the bailiffs led her away, she turned to look at me one last time. The hatred was still there, but underneath it, I saw something else. Disbelief that her perfect crime had been exposed by the teenager she'd tried to control. Uncle received 15 years for his role as accomplice. Part of me felt sorry for him, but he'd chosen to help Gertrude rather than save my mother. His children, my cousins, were placed with other relatives. I hoped they would have a better chance than I'd had. The legal battles continued for months. Gertrude's assets were liquidated to pay restitution to her victims. The mansion where I'd been held prisoner was sold. The designer clothes she'd bought me were donated to charity. Every trace of her influence was systematically removed from our lives. My mother's recovery progressed slowly but steadily. Physical therapy helped her regain mobility. Speech therapy restored her voice. Occupational therapy taught her to manage daily tasks again. I moved back in with her once she was released from the rehabilitation facility, returning to our small apartment that Gertrude had mocked. We attended therapy together, processing the trauma Gertrude had inflicted. Some days were harder than others. My mother struggled with survivor's guilt, knowing other relatives hadn't been as fortunate. I dealt with nightmares about Gertrude escaping prison and coming for us. The other families Gertrude had victimized formed an informal support network. We met monthly to share our experiences and healing journey. Some had lost parents to Gertrude's greed, others had lost life savings, but we all shared the bond of surviving Gertrude's manipulation. I returned to my old school, graduating with honors years despite everything. My volunteer work at the Children's Hospital had continued throughout the trial, providing stability when everything else felt chaotic. The kids I worked with didn't care about the trial or Gertrude. They just needed someone to read to them, to play games, to be present. College applications asked about significant challenges I'd overcome. I wrote about resilience, about fighting for truth, about the importance of protecting those who couldn't protect themselves. Several schools offered scholarships, moved by my story, but more importantly by my grades and volunteer record. My mother returned to work part-time once she was physically able. Her employer had held her position, understanding the extraordinary circumstances. She tired easily and sometimes needed help, but she was determined to rebuild our life without Gertrude's blood money. We learned Gertrude had filed appeals from prison, still maintaining her innocence. Her lawyer argued procedural errors, insufficient evidence, biased jury. Each appeal was denied. The evidence was too overwhelming, the crimes too heinous. Gertrude would die in prison, never accepting responsibility for what she'd done. Sometimes I wondered about the life I might have had if Gertrude had simply been the loving aunt she'd pretended to be, if she'd actually rescued me from poverty instead of trying to steal my inheritance. But those thoughts led nowhere productive. Gertrude had made her choices, and I'd made mine. The Children's Hospital offered me a part-time job after graduation, working with their volunteer coordination program. I accepted immediately. It felt right to help other teenagers find purpose through service, the way volunteering had saved me during the darkest period of my life. My mother and I developed new traditions to replace the ones Gertrude had tainted. Instead of cake for good grades, we went for walks in the park. Instead of dwelling on the accident anniversary, we celebrated her recovery milestones. We built a life defined by survival and love, not by Gertrude's crimes. One day, while organizing volunteer schedules at the hospital, I received a letter forwarded from the prosecutor's office. Gertrude had written from prison, not to apologize, but to inform me she'd written a book about her wrongful conviction, and that I featured prominently as the troubled niece who destroyed her life. The publisher had rejected it, finding her claims unbelievable against the court evidence. I threw the letter away without responding. Gertrude had no power over me anymore. She could write all the letters she wanted from her cell. She could maintain her innocence until her last breath. It didn't matter. The truth had been told, justice had been served, and my mother was alive. My mother eventually moved from wheelchair to walker to walking independently. Her recovery amazed her doctors, who credited the treatments Gertrude had denied her for so long. We celebrated each milestone quietly, grateful for the chance Gertrude had tried to steal from us. The volunteer program at the hospital grew under my coordination. More teenagers found purpose in helping sick children and their families. I shared my story when appropriate, showing them how service could provide strength during personal crisis. Several volunteers told me later that the program had saved them from their own dark paths. As I prepared to leave for college, my mother and I went through our apartment, deciding what I would take with me. We found a photo album Gertrude had given me during those early weeks, filled with pictures of her mansion and elite prep school. All the things she'd said my mother could never provide. We threw it in the trash without ceremony. My mother drove me to college orientation, a journey she wouldn't have been able to make if Gertrude had succeeded. We didn't talk about Gertrude during the drive. Instead, we discussed my class schedule, dormitory arrangements, the volunteer opportunities I'd already researched at the campus hospital, normal mother-daughter conversations Gertrude had tried to prevent forever. Standing in my dorm room, my mother hugged me tightly. We both knew this moment almost hadn't happened. Gertrude had almost stolen it from us, but we were here, together, alive and healing. That was the only victory that mattered. As I watched my mother drive away, I thought about the strange journey that had brought me here. From a 16-year-old celebrating straight A's to a survivor of attempted murder and family betrayal. Gertrude had tried to destroy us for money, but she'd failed to understand that our bond was stronger than her greed. I started college with purpose, knowing exactly what I wanted to study and why. Social work with a focus on family advocacy. I would help other teenagers trapped in abusive guardianships. I would fight for patients whose families were making dangerous medical decisions. I would be the advocate I'd needed during those dark months with Gertrude. My mother texted me every day, sometimes just emoji hearts or photos of her lunch, simple communications that Gertrude had forbidden. We were rebuilding our relationship one small moment at a time, grateful for each opportunity Gertrude had tried to steal. The other students in my dorm had normal worries about exams and relationships. I helped them with their problems, finding comfort in ordinary college drama. They knew nothing about Gertrude or the trial unless I chose to share, which I rarely did. Here, I could just be a regular student, not the girl who'd exposed her aunt's murder plot. During winter break, I returned home to find my mother had redecorated our apartment. She'd painted the walls bright colors and hung new pictures. She was reclaiming her space, creating a home free from Gertrude's shadow. We spent the holidays quietly, just the two of us, the way it should have been all along. The volunteer work continued throughout college. I expanded the program to include art therapy and music therapy for the children. Local news did a small feature on the program's growth, but I declined to be interviewed. Gertrude had craved spotlight and recognition. I preferred working quietly, making real differences in individual lives. My mother started dating again during my sophomore year. The man was kind, patient with her recovery limitations, understanding of our complicated history. I watched carefully at first, paranoid after Gertrude's betrayal, but he proved himself through consistent small actions, never pushing for more than my mother was ready to give. Letters from Gertrude continued arriving occasionally, forwarded through various legal channels. I stopped opening them. Whatever she had to say from her prison cell held no interest for me. She'd had her chance to be family, to be the aunt she'd pretended to be. She'd chosen murder instead. During my junior year, I received notice that Gertrude had died in prison. A heart attack, the official report said. She'd been 63 years old, having served only 5 years of her life sentence. I felt nothing at first, then a strange sense of relief. The last threat to our peace was gone. My mother and I attended the small funeral her lawyer arranged, not out of forgiveness, but for closure. Gertrude was buried in a simple grave with only her name and dates. No loving aunt, no devoted sister, just a marker for a life wasted on greed and violence. After the funeral, my mother and I visited the graves of Gertrude's other victims. We left flowers and apologized for what our family member had done. Some of their relatives were there, and we embraced wordlessly. Gertrude had created a community of of survivors who understood each other's pain without explanation. I graduated college with honors and immediately began working for a family advocacy organization. My first case involved a teenager whose guardian was making suspicious medical decisions. I recognized the signs immediately and helped build the case that removed the child from danger. Gertrude had taught me well, though not in the way she'd intended. My mother fully recovered her independence, returning to work full-time and even taking up hiking. She sent me photos from trail summits, her face glowing with achievement. Every picture was a victory Gertrude had tried to prevent, a life fully lived despite attempted murder.